The news cycle was being dominated by a president who was completely out of control and seemed eager to start a nuclear war. A lot of the reaction I saw to it then was just fun, aliens. I think it also helped that it wasn't very polarized. Marco Rubio and Harry Reid both are really into aliens. If we knew what the aliens wanted to do on capital gains taxes, maybe there would be like a real divide there. But are there aliens seems fairly neutral.
I'm Jon Favreau. Welcome to Offline. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Max Fisher.
And you just heard from today's guest, senior correspondent at Vox, Dylan Matthews. It's conspiracy theory week here at Offline.
Oh my God, is it?
We're going to talk about a listener named Kate who's taken the offline challenge a little too seriously.
She's doing great, though. Her screen time numbers are amazing.
Very low.
Yeah.
Because it's been months since anyone has seen or heard from the Princess of Wales and future Queen of England. Where the hell is she? Why did she post a heavily photoshopped, maybe even fake Mother's Day picture on Twitter?
Oh.
And why can't we all stop talking about it?
I can't. I can't give it up.
Me neither, man. Then after the break, Max, I know you talked to your old colleague at Vox, Dylan Matthews, about another conspiracy theory that took the internet by storm, the Pentagon's 2021 UFO report, which is a fascinating story with cameos from former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, the drummer of Blink-182, didn't know that, and a handful of reporters at the New York Times. How was the conversation?
So he's actually the guitarist and lead singer from Blink-182.
Oh, wow. Misinformation right here in the script.
It was great. So I have been on my soapbox for years that all of these like UFO stories that have been running in the New York Times for the past 6-7 years, like they're just fake. They're just not real. And I think if you know the story of like the backstory of how this like UFO thing came to dominate news coverage, or like how it came into news coverage like this, I think it all becomes very clear. So I was very happy to
excited to
finally get the backstory of that out there.
That's great. Okay, cool. Yeah, I've always Harry Reid was always on this, R.I.P. But he was always he was like the big UFO guy. And when I was in the White House, it was always like, oh, well, Harry Reid is a real UFO.
It turns out there's a big money donor story behind his involvement in UFOs, too. It's what it all comes back to.
Oh, this is fascinating. Okay, I'm going to listen. Before we get to all that, a potential ban on TikTok in the United States is one step closer to becoming reality. The House of Representatives, by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 352 to 65, they don't even vote like that to fund the government. They don't even to keep themselves being paid.
They've been listening to Offline. They know social media is bad.
So passed legislation that would force ByteDance to sell the popular video app to an American buyer or face a possible ban from the app stores. Joe Biden has said he'll sign the legislation, but first it needs to pass the Senate, where it must overcome opposition from a horde of angry TikTokers, an army of lobbyists, and a strange mix of politicians in both parties, including Donald Trump. So, Max, we talked about this last week, but the legislation has moved so quickly. So I think it's worth checking back in. Do you think this will actually end up on Biden's desk?
I think the honest truth is that we don't know. A lot of senators have been very mum about whether or not they will support it. The two chairs of the Intelligence Committee, Marco Rubio and Mark Warner, have said they will support it.
Offline guest Mark Warner, who talked about this a year ago on this very program.
He has been very on this issue, yeah. But Chuck Schumer will not even say whether he will bring it up for a vote. So clearly there's a lot of like backroom negotiation happening within the Senate. And I think it's just legitimately not clear whether they're going to vote it forward or not.
We're not in the prediction business here at Crooked Media.
However,
but I'll venture one for this. I think I lean no.
Really?
For a couple of reasons. The Senate is extremely slow.
Yeah.
That's just how they are. I do think the political backlash or the concern about the political effects in an election year, I think like it went through the House pretty fast, but I think there's going to be some worries on the Democratic side, especially.
Yeah. Do they want to be seen as the party that took away your TikTok?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I'm trying to count, like, are there 60 votes, right? Because it's not just 50 votes. It can have to be 60 votes in the Senate. So that's a lot. It's a lot of votes.
It does feel like the kind of issue where nobody wants to vote against, making the Communist Party linked company sell off the like bad for teen mental health app. But at the same time, nobody wants to be like holding the knife for taking away TikTok, which is extremely popular, especially with young people.
And even if you take away the politics, there are other competing bills. Like I think Maria Cantwell has another bill in the Senate that's floating around that would actually like empower the Commerce Department, and it gets into a lot of technical details.
Right.
But there are different competing versions of what the best way to go about this is, and even the White House has said like they want to keep working on the legislation with people. So that makes me think it's and we're in an election year, and most business in Congress ends by the spring or summer of an election year. So I don't know. I don't know if it happens before the election.
If I had to put money down, which again, why am I making predictions? No one is forcing me to put money down. It's the pundits fallacy here. It would be that they come out with some kind of compromise that we're going to do something like this Project Texas thing where they're required to like house the data centers in the US or something like that. So they can say like, look, we solved the problem, but also we're not going to take this extreme step.
Yeah. So TikTokers have taken the ban less than well.
Yeah.
Creators have claimed that Congress is pushing this ban to silence the youth, deplatform small businesses, and even snuff out pro-Palestinian perspectives. Let's play some clips.
They're trying to ban TikTok because this app is pro-Palestinian.
This time they're not bluffing, and I wanted to know what was different, and I think it's because we did something that actually worked this time. Think about Starbucks, think about Kellogg, think about the fact that there's a list going around for how many other companies we plan on hitting.
They are voting to ban the complaint box rather than listen to a single complaint on this fucking app. They see us talking to each other. They see us seeing the humanity in each other's eyes. I don't care if you got a red hat or a fucking septum piercing. I hear your complaints and I see the world you're standing in.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
I know.
Let's take it down a notch.
It's definitely a big, like, I make a video on TikTok, therefore I'm the protagonist of American politics happening here.
But also, the like, this is a plan to snuff out pro-Palestinian perspectives. Like, if you want to see horrific images from this awful war, they are everywhere.
Sure.
They are not limited to TikTok.
Yeah.
It's all over the news.
Yeah. And protesters, actual physical real world protesters have, I think, been much more effective at raising awareness around this than the people who are going viral on TikTok.
And to all the other points, people are arguing and yelling and seeing. I mean, show me the app where people are seeing humanity in each other. But but they're doing that everywhere. They're doing that everywhere. It's a little. I get it. I get if your experience and your only experience is your main source of information and entertainment is TikTok. It feels quite existential.
Threatening.
I get that.
And I think, to be fair, my sense is that while there is certainly a faction of TikTok that says we are the most important political actors in the world, and therefore if they want to ban this app, it's because they hate how much change we're making. I do get the sense that the majority of energy on the app is much more reasonably like, I enjoy this app. There are funny videos on it. I don't want it taken away. It's a fun thing that I do to spend 45 minutes a day on. So, you know, don't take that away from me. Yeah,
on Twitter, the other hellhole of a social media platform that I'm addicted to.
Where we look into each other's eyes and see each other's humanity. Yeah.
Someone tweeted like, there's this very popular thread. Please post the TikTok videos that are the best argument for why it shouldn't be banned.
Sure.
And
they're good.
And like I'd say 90% of them are not political at all. They're
That's
just
right.
Hilarious, funny, great, creative. So like I get it. I get it. What do you think the arguments against a TikTok ban are that carry the most weight to you?
So I think there's actually a few. One is that there's not very much evidence that China would use TikTok to spy on Americans, something a lot of people have pointed out, even people who are very concerned about TikTok otherwise. It's like, if China wants to get your data, there are better and easier ways for them to do it than using TikTok. Number two, political interference via the app, right? Like China leaning on ByteDance to lean on TikTok to manipulate our politics is certainly plausible, but I don't think it's been demonstrated that that is something that has happened. And so it's kind of a hypothetical concern more than something that's actually happening. The other, like those things aside, like number three, TikTok is just as bad as all the other social apps. So I think there's a very valid question to be raised here legally as well as just like politically within our debate. Like, why are we focusing on this one and not Meta, not Instagram, not Facebook, not YouTube, which are just as bad on every other thing you might criticize TikTok on? This will entrench the dominance of those players. This is just going to make Meta and Google even more monopolistic than they already are, which is going to make the problems that those apps cause in our society any worse. And I number 5, it's like, I don't hear people bring this up a lot, but I am very concerned about the escalatory precedent that this sets for relations between the US and China. A huge concern that I had and a lot of like foreign policy people had the last couple of years is decoupling between the US and China. Like every tit for tat step where we're breaking away our economic and political links with China and they're doing the same, where does that lead? Like, I think taking another big step in that, and this is going to basically force China to then ban American companies in retaliation, or not force them, but they're full compelled to. And then are we going to do more of that? Or are we going to start banning more Chinese companies? And I just like do not think that is a healthy direction to send this incredibly important bilateral relationship.
Yeah. I keep going back and forth on this. Like, we have had rules in place, laws in place for quite some time that limit foreign ownership of American media companies and broadcast networks.
Yeah.
TikTok,
and that is a compelling argument, I think.
TikTok is a broadcast network that 170 million Americans use.
Yeah.
It is gigantic.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's been arguments about like xenophobia or racism, but it's like, it's not about China. It's about the Chinese government. Like,
sure.
Like it's a sometimes brutal authoritarian regime.
Yeah.
And it's
quite
not,
often,
it's
you might
not
say.
like, you know, it's not South Korea or Japan that has this company. We wouldn't be having this conversation then.
Yeah.
Or a European country or most South America. Like, name your country. There's only a few that are truly authoritarian that we're concerned about, and the Chinese government is one of them. And the other thing I keep thinking about is all these House members went into a like classified briefing, and they came out. And in the Energy and Commerce Committee, they voted 50-0 on this. And Republicans and Democrats aren't agreeing on anything these days. That said, if you're going to take away this platform for people for that 170 million Americans are using, you've got to make the case better than they have made the case.
Right.
And like, I realize that, probably some of the stuff was classified in a briefing, but whatever, you have to make some kind of presentation and convince the American people that this actually is a threat and why it's a threat. Is it the spying capabilities? Is it the propaganda capabilities? If so, what are they? Or at least you can talk in broad strokes about them. And if politicians can't do that, if the president can't do that, if Congress can't do that, then I don't think they should try to ban it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that really speaks to why people feel so upset about this, is that we hear these kind of contradictory arguments that it's like it's a foreign policy decision because why would we allow this hostile authoritarian government to own a giant American media company or a giant media company that operates in America? And like, I think you're right. I think that's probably the actual motivation for the ban, but a lot of it gets couched in this like, oh, it's teen mental health, it's phone addiction. And it's like, if that were true, we all know that you would be regulating the American social media companies, and you're not. So I think that not only do they have to make a case, and I agree with that, but I think they also need to stop trying to hang the case on things that we know are not the actual reason for it. Because if they were, again, we'd be regulating Meta.
Yeah. Well, I also think there's like First Amendment issues with American-based companies that aren't necessarily there for foreign-based companies. That's true. Which is why we're not regulating them for a whole bunch of other reasons. But again, we know everyone knows the position of offline, ban all algorithms.
Yes,
no, seriously. I mean, that's my position on this.
I think there is also it's something I would love to see them do is like, let's pair this with saying we're actually going to try to pass federal data privacy laws. And let's put those two together and say this is all part of a package where we're trying to protect American consumers rather than saying we're trying to punish American consumers to make this like foreign policy based decision.
I think that's absolutely right on privacy. On the algorithms and the influence and all that kind of stuff, I think it's just it's a tough argument that I don't think a lot of our leaders have made.
Yeah.
Why these algorithmic social media apps are bad for you, aside from, like you said, teen mental health and stuff like that. But it's like, we are in this fight for the survival of democracy. Stop sealing people in a cocoon of their own biases and interests.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's like antithetical to democracy, which requires empathy and curiosity and thoughtful debate in order to survive. Like that, there's a bigger issue here that I think if you're going to make an argument about democracy, that you should make that argument. And by the way, if our concern is that an authoritarian government is going to interfere in our elections or spread propaganda here, you can't go about banning it in an authoritarian-like way.
Yeah, right.
If we want to defend democracy, we have to be democratic about it and have the argument, you know?
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway, that's my thing. All right, on to the biggest news of the millennium.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, so we are recording this on Friday, March 15th, just in case anything happens. And Kate Middleton, the future Queen of England, hasn't been seen or heard from in public since Christmas. Except for 2 grainy photos of her in cars and a March 10th Mother's Day photo.
Or are they photos of her?
Right. March 10th Mother's Day, first of all, one of the low-key weirder parts of this scandal is that I didn't know that Mother's Day was in March in the UK.
Yeah, they have their own Mother's Day. That's right. It's all part of the imperial decline.
Globalization? Why don't we all just pick a Mother's Day? Anyway. So she hasn't been seen since so there's the 2 grainy photos and a March 10th Mother's Day photo of her and her children that she posted on Twitter, which she later admitted was photoshopped by her.
Well, she, quote unquote, she admitted.
Yeah, she admitted. Yeah, okay. She posted. Oh, there was a post from her.
The Palace posted.
The Palace posted.
Yeah.
But it said signed C from her. That she just loves experimenting with photo editing and is sorry if anyone took offense. So people saw her in public on Christmas Day. Then on January 17th, Kensington Palace announced that the day before she had gone into the hospital for a pre-planned abdominal surgery.
Pre-planned, but no one had heard about this before.
Right. Pre-planned,
so we're
just
already
to her.
getting some red flags. Yeah.
And has been putting out periodic statements since then that she's home, recovering well, and will reappear on Easter, which is a good day for that kind of thing traditionally. But
wow, did we just float a new Kate conspiracy that she is risen?
She is risen.
Good for her.
I was just
love that.
Easter? Really? So, but that has not stopped the conspiracy theories, Max, which went from typical internet crazy to full-blown global hysteria after she posted an apology for photoshopping the Mother's Day picture, or an apology for photoshopping the Mother's Day picture was posted.
Right.
Allegedly by her. All right. Have you brought me a whiteboard and some red string?
We're wheeling it in. We're gonna need 2 or 3 whiteboards.
What is your take on this? When did you start following it? What do you think is happening?
What is my take? So I became ambiently aware even before the photo, capital T, capital P, came out on March 10th. People had been kind of aware for a while that Kate Middleton was not showing up, that it was weird that she hadn't been out there for a while. The surgery announcement was throwing people off a little bit. I think there's a lot of people who just as a hobby have fun tracking what's going on with the royal family. But I will say it did not really crystallize for me how weird this was until the photo came out. Was clearly photoshopped.
Yeah.
The AP put out a kill notice on the photo where they send out a memo to news agencies basically saying don't use this photo because it's faked, which is a big deal. And that was when it was oh, this is actually really strange. And the statements that were coming out where they're refusing to elaborate on the abdominal surgery is strange. The fact that we haven't seen her except for this one grainy photo where she's faced away from the camera, which is this photo was taken by Abraham Zapruder, apparently.
There was another photo where she's in the car with her mom.
That's true.
Where you can see her. Well, she has very big sunglasses on, but yeah. It does appear to be her.
It's all. So I think a lot of this, of course, and I think we all know this on some level, a lot of this is probably just the palace is being really ham-handed about how they manage the publicity around this. British tabloids love to dig into every little detail. They've been diverting it very quickly to be oh, this is actually about Prince William's mistress is pregnant, which is, to be clear, just a thing that they speculating on and just making up as an explanation. Probably.
We think.
Right. Look, probably she's just sick. They actually, I didn't know this until I was looking at the research last night. They actually said when she went into surgery, she will be out of communication until March 31st.
Yeah.
So when you see that, it's oh, it's actually not as mysterious as I thought it was.
Right.
But I really think that just what's going on here is it's just fun. It's a fun thing to look at the photos. Anyone can participate. You zoom in on it. It's this kind of big collective game that we all get to play about speculating about what's going on. And it's a goofy story.
A lot of fun jokes.
Yeah.
Really good content from this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what matters, right? Not Kate Middleton's privacy or health or well-being, but we need to have some good fun.
Well, I do think that is part of it, is I think that we are all aware that this is someone who is going to be enormously wealthy and powerful for the rest of her life based on her job of waving to the camera occasionally. And like, look, I'm a professional podcaster, so like I have one of the all-time great bullshit jobs. I'm not giving her shit for it, but I think that it just feels very safe. It's not a controversial topic. It's one of the like last remaining topics we have that is not politically polarized. It's a reprieve from like everything that is terrifying about the news. So I do think it's just like a fun group activity that we get to have on our social media apps that are normally really upsetting and terrifying because it's about the war in Gaza, it's about the election that's coming up. And I think that it's like the fact that it is kind of news, but in a like for once fun way, and way that it's like emotionally a relief and enjoyable and feels socially bonding. I just think that's what's going on here. I don't think it's about lost trust in media. I don't think we're all becoming QAnon. Which is an argument a lot of people are making.
There was Helen Lewis in The Atlantic wrote a piece that said, this is QAnon for wine moms.
Which is a great headline.
And look, I like wine. I'm not a mom. And in my For You feed on Twitter, all Kate content.
Are you pouring yourself a glass and scrolling the Kate Middleton?
Well, my wife, Emily, and a couple other of our friends are on a text chain. They're very interested in it, and I have joined this text chain now a little belatedly.
Okay. So you guys like exching conspiracies?
Travis Hellwig, who was a crooked media staffer, he's on it too. So yeah, I have no theory. Here's my thing on this. I am not one for conspiracy theories. Like my first inclination is to always dismiss them because I think that people are either too fundamentally honest and decent, or much more likely too stupid to pull them off. That is that is my overall take. I worked in the White House. I saw firsthand that scandals or mistakes that people attributed to nefarious motivations ended up being just people being
fuck-ups.
Stupid, fuck-ups, whatever, incompetence.
Right.
And I still think incompetence probably is the explanation behind this one, because I cannot imagine something dumber than how the photo was handled from start to finish,
Obviously
which is why
I
am open to the more nefarious theory. Only because of that. Like I just, the people who do, like these are, I realize that the royal family is a very ancient institution, but the PR people around them, they do this for a living,
right?
And the tabloids in the UK are like, if maybe the only ones worse than here in the US, especially around the royal family. Yeah, and so like these PR people around the prince and princess and king and queen, like they weren't born yesterday. Like, why post the photo at all? Why post the photo at all? Why fake it? Why Photoshop it in such an obviously clumsy way?
Wait, are you saying you think they deliberately posted a photo that we would notice was altered to
No, I don't think that. I'm just like, but
that would be a fun conspiracy.
But why would you take that what are they doing? why did they need to post it? And then why of all things, why did they follow up? Well, in the original photo, by the way, it says like taken by the Prince of Wales, right? So William supposedly takes the picture. But then on the follow-up, they have Kate take the fall and say, oh, it was me photo editing? Why?
I think that is part of why this has become such a big story, is that because the handling of it has been so ham-fisted, it kind of invites all of us in to like, let's look at the photo metadata. Like, let's look at the fact that her tweet doesn't make any sense, or that like the official timeline doesn't match up with like what they've been doing in terms of like canceling or postponing her events. That because of how many screw-ups the PR people have made, they've kind of laid out this game for us where we get to go through and like finding the inconsistencies and like piece together like what do the strands actually connect to.
Well, this is just me with my like, you know, my PR press relations background hat on, but I'm like, I don't know that I've seen a move this stupid.
Do you know what it actually really reminds me of? Did you follow the like press tour controversy over this movie a year ago, Don't Worry, Darling?
Yes.
Okay. Where that it's like one of the stars like allegedly spit on one of the other stars, but they're like, people are not showing up to their events. It's like, clearly they just like all got in a big fight. And the PR for it was handled terribly, much like this, was very ham-fisted, where we get these official explanations that are clearly not true. And that made it really fun to like dig into it and try to figure out what's happening.
And I'm pretty close with someone who was heavily involved in that movie. And
was it Harry Styles?
It was not any of the stars. The person who wrote it. And so
I'm hearing Harry Styles.
And when they were all over there in Europe, when all this was happening for the president, like none of them knew exactly what the fallout, like they didn't know the intent until they came back home. And then they saw the president, was like, holy shit, what's been happening over there? So there is a little bit of like, I bring that up because, perhaps the royal family and certainly maybe even the PR people in the family are not quite as online as we all are. But I find that hard to believe because it's their job.
The palace is a very old institution, and they are very accustomed to British media kind of deferring to them on a lot. So I think it is possible that they were just like not ready for this level of scrutiny. And also just people, like you say, people screw up sometimes. I will say something that like an argument I have seen a lot of people make that I do want to raise because it's really dominant out there is that this shows that like we are all becoming like QAnon in the sense that we no longer trust institutions and our sense of reality is fractured and we don't believe in anything anymore. And I think that gets what's happening exactly backwards. I actually think the lesson we should take from this is not that we are all becoming like QAnon, but I think rather what we should learn is that like things like QAnon are more driven by the sense of fun of pulling together a conspiracy than I think we appreciate. They're more driven by the fact that it's just bonding to like come together with your pals on the Discord or the Facebook group or whatever and like pull out a photo of Donald Trump and try to figure out what's going on in it. And I think we have underrated how much groups like QAnon that are very scary also, but are also just driven by the fact that like a lot of people are online and this is a way to feel like you have a sense of community and a sense of fun at a time when the news is very scary.
I think that's an excellent point. And it's also like the issue of trust.
Sure.
Low trust, loss of trust is sort of like the defining characteristic of this era.
It is. Yeah.
But we've known that for a while.
Right.
And sort of like, a loss of faith in institutions. It started that way. It's sort of like trickled down to each other. Mm-hmm. And I almost think that this is like a response to that.
Yeah.
And that like, well, we're all going to form a community. We obviously know that they're lying to us. But we can't trust, whether they're lying or not, we can't trust them to tell the truth.
Right.
But now we're going to form this community and try to figure out our own truth, which can go, as we've seen with QAnon and places like that, quite badly.
Yeah.
Or it can be harmless fun.
I think that's true. And I think it's also important to know that like the psychological research into conspiracy belief, something that they really emphasize is that the point of these kind of like conspiracy parsing groups or collective efforts is not necessarily to try to arrive at an explanation, but because the act itself of like sharing and discussing a conspiracy in like your group chat, that in and of itself gives you a sense of control and ownership over what's happening. It gives you a sense of like, I'm participating in this. I'm figuring out what's going on. That makes me feel more stable, like more control over what's happening in the world, especially at a time when like the news is very scary and we feel out of control.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to think of it as like the act of like all the Taylor Swift stuff, like parsing out like where is she going when she's like, I think less the point of that is to actually arrive at a conclusion of like what's the secret message that she's trying to send us, and more just the fact that doing that with all your fellow Swifties online makes you feel like you have a sense of community and makes you feel like you have a handle on what's going on in the world.
I think this is going to end with Kate Middleton reappearing with well-known London boy Joe Alwyn, Taylor Swift X, and that's really going to connect it all. Yeah, I will. The whole thing about like, I've seen a lot of takes about this is QAnon for wine moms and what's with everyone's lost their mind with the conspiracy theories. Again, I lay the blame for this on the palace because of the picture.
Absolutely,
it is total. It's one thing to be like, the poor girl had surgery and like she said, I'm going to need time to recuperate. You won't hear from me. Like, just leave her alone. Totally get that. The picture and the handling of the picture. Like, I'm just a humble podcaster. Probably have less than 1% name ID in this country. If I suddenly disappeared around Christmas for a surgery and Crooked just put out a statement, and then none of you guys talked about it in any of the shows,
It would be weird.
and I was like, I'll be back on March 31st, and then suddenly I just posted a picture of me and Teddy and Charlie that was just completely fake.
That's true. It would invite some questions.
It would invite some questions.
Right. Especially
from a small group of people, but yeah, it would invite some questions.
Especially if people kept asking us, like, hey, what's going on with Jon?
Right.
And we just straight up refused to say, refused to tell anyone. And we were also like, it's abdominal, but you can't see his face. People would be like, that's fucking weird. That's suspect.
and I just put up a picture of myself with like 7 fingers.
and also the royal children.
Anyway, it's wild. I can't wait to hear what happens. After the break, Max talks to Dylan Matthews about a New York Times UFO series that convinced the internet aliens were among us.
Ooh.
Aliens, but not Kate Middleton.
They're coming on next week, the aliens. Dylan Matthews, welcome to Offline.
Thank you for having me, Max Fisher.
It's great to be chatting with my old pal. So, Dylan, you wrote in 2021 a big piece that I still send to people all the time, anytime they tell me that the UFOs are real. And your piece kind of traced the very strange circumstances and personalities that had led to the mainstreaming of the idea that UFOs are here, announced, of course, via several big New York Times stories. And I wanted to get into it because it feels like as of this week, the fever is maybe breaking. Like this long-awaited Pentagon study came out, produced as a result of all of those UFO stories that concluded, quote, all investigative efforts at all levels of classification concluded that most sightings were ordinary objects of phenomenon and the result of misidentification. And it said there were no aliens.
It's very sad, but we have to live with the reality we have.
Well, okay. So I want to talk about how we ended up with this story instead. Go through the timeline from fringe conspiracy to mainstream New York Times. But before we get to that, can you just explain the these 3 videos that kind of become at the center of all this? Like, what are the videos? What do they show? Who recorded them?
Sure. So I believe they're all Navy videos from naval aviators. And these were the sort of focus of the December 2017 New York Times story that sort of mainstreamed this story, at least in the current era. And they were all cases where naval aviators saw kind of odd things on their either on their radars or their cameras. So there's one that's sometimes called the Tic Tac incident. That was off the coast of San Diego, about 100 miles. Mm-hmm. These 2 pilots, David Fravor and Amy Dietrich, saw this object that Fravor described as kind of turning abruptly and mimicking me, and then simply disappearing. And then he claims that a few seconds later, another flight crew reacquired the target. And
like
this
60
was about
miles
60
away.
miles away. Yeah. So this is where you get some of the claims about them having sort of superhuman speed, having abilities that we don't know of American or Chinese or Russian.
Because they're turning at crazy angles in the sky or shooting off.
Right. Suddenly. So this video is called the Fleur 1 video, is the one that this other team took based on the Fravor and Dietrich testimony.
Which is named for Fleur, the infrared camera they have on all these Navy fighter jets.
Exactly. And the second one, Gimbal, is similarly named after sort of the gimbal camera. That was a fighter jet off of Florida. And you can listen to it. It's funny to just watch naval fighter pilots talk to each other. It's different from Top Gun, but not as much as you might think.
Yes, it's so funny hearing these videos. They do not talk in the way you think. There's one of them is at one point is like, bro, we're surrounded by drones. And it's like,
and then you think about it and you're like, yeah, these are 25-year-olds.
Right, yes.
Yeah, of course they talk like this.
Flying billion-dollar airplanes. Yeah.
Yeah, but one of the pilots says he sees a whole fleet of these. Mm-hmm. And then there was a third one, which was recorded also in 2015. So both Gimbal and Go Faster 2015 videos.
Right.
That one shows a sort of small white object that's going over water, and it appears to be going over the water very, very rapidly. And you can hear the pilots getting very, very excited about this. So these were first written about in December 2017. In March 2018, so a few months later, the Pentagon officially released them, declassified them. The guy who I think is the crucial source for the New York Times in those stories is a guy named Christopher Mellon. And once you start following the sources from Christopher Mellon, you get into a whole interesting web of people very interested in aliens and sort of motivated by a very strong desire to believe.
Well, that's actually exactly what I want to talk about, because the videos, of course, are real in that they really recorded these incidents. And then people saw the New York Times stories reporting on these videos several years later. But I think what is really fascinating here in the story that you tell is about Christopher Mellon and these like 4 other personalities who kind of convene around these videos. This very like odd group. Honestly, it would make for an amazing like Hulu miniseries, because these 4 or 5 very strong personalities come together, and they are the people who take these videos and then construct around them, or not, they wouldn't say construct, they would say kind of help inform the rest of the world about their reading the videos, which is it shows, you know, the existence of flying saucers over American coastlines. So we start with Christopher Mellon. He's our first big personality. Who is he? Where does he come from? How does he get into UFOs?
So Christopher Mellon is first of all, he's a Mellon. So anyone who's gone to Carnegie Mellon or who knows about the banker Andrew Mellon, who was later Secretary of Treasury and kind of caused the Great Depression.
So an accomplished man.
He was an accomplished man, but Chris Mellon was sort of a career intelligence guy. He had been Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intel under Clinton and George W. Bush.
Serious guy.
Long tenure as a civilian in the intelligence community. He gets very interested in UFOs. And he has said that he has a longstanding interest in this, but that the guy who sort of made him turn pro once he retired from government was a guy named Tom DeLonge.
Yes, what I think the most fascinating personality in this whole story.
This is America in one book. So Tom DeLonge, fellow children of the late 90s will remember, is the guitarist for Blink-182.
A truly trash band.
Look, I have my disagreements with the man. Let's not say things about all the small things.
You're right.
And what's my age again that we can't take back.
You're right. Let's hold to the substance.
Bops. He and Mark Hoppus and Travis Barker were like a really impressive trio in their heyday. I have all their albums. Look, I'm trying to build connections here. Tom DeLonge is very interested in aliens. And he had started this group called To the Stars Academy that became kind of like, it almost started to feel like a think tank in that it was a waiting area for ex-government people with an interest in a given topic.
Right.
And so if you're interested in counterinsurgency, you go to the Center for New American Security. If you're into aliens, you go to the Stars Academy. And so Christopher Mellon goes to the Stars Academy.
He gets recruited, right? Like Tom DeLonge calls him.
Tom DeLonge called me out of the blue one day, Mellon says.
Okay, so Tom DeLonge is like the great convener. He pulls in Christopher Mellon to his group, and he also pulls in this guy, Luis Elizondo, who is very important to this story. Can you tell us about him?
Yes. So Elizondo is also our connection point to some of the early history of these investigations. So Elizondo, like Mellon, is a former civil servant.
Mm-hmm.
He's a former counterintelligence officer by background. And he gets into this around 2010, and he takes over this program that's called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And so this is a group at DoD that's tasked with investigating these videos. And so any time that a aviator, a spy camera, or whatever, sees an object that seems strange and not easily explained, it goes to this team. And you might be wondering, why does the DoD have a team like this? I mean, on the one hand, it's not an unreasonable thing for them to have. Like,
sure.
As we saw with the Chinese spy incident with the balloon last year, there is weird stuff happening in the skies,
right.
And it's the DoD's job to figure out what it is. And so that was part of their job, but also Harry Reid, who at this point was Senate Majority Leader and Senator from Nevada, he had a longstanding interest in UFOs himself. And he also had a relationship with a guy named Robert Bigelow, who was a Nevada businessman. Very important in this story. So Robert Bigelow is in some ways kind of patient zero of this whole phenomenon.
Where did he get his money again? It's like hotels, right?
Extended stay hotels. He became rich from Budget Suites of America. I think we're now familiar with the idea that if you get rich from some means, eventually you will want to build rockets. And
he kind of invents this, but he's not building rockets, right? He wants to track the rockets because they're being flown by little green men.
He has dreams of building the rockets. He has, he wants to build he wants to be the SpaceX of space stations. He wants to build his own commercial space station.
Really?
Himself. This has not gone anywhere, but they've launched a couple experimental things. He also always been interested in the paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1995, he starts this thing called the National Institute for Discovery Science. That's interested in things like it's interested in UFOs. It's also interested in cattle mutilation, which is
really
a sort of connected to UFOs, but a common kind of like spooky occurrence in the country. Sort of like crop circles or other sort of strange phenomena that feel vaguely linked to the paranormal.
I see.
And as part of these studies, he also bought this cattle ranch in Utah called Skinwalker Ranch and rigged it with all kinds of cameras. Anyway, so Robert Bigelow, into all this kind of stuff, has a lot of money, has a relationship with Harry Reid. Harry Reid, I think, was initially receptive to this himself. Like, I don't want to make it seem like
he's a UFO guy.
He didn't care. He's a UFO guy.
Yeah.
Harry Reid gets a bunch of money in what's called the black budget, which is the classified part of the intelligence budget where the details aren't made public. It gets about $22 million to set up a section at the DoD. And so that's the section where Luis Elizondo, this career civil servant, starts studying these videos and starts becoming convinced that something out of the ordinary is happening in them.
So just to pull these connections together, Robert Bigelow, the Skinwalker Ranch guy, the extended stay hotels guy, is a donor to Harry Reid, and he wants Harry Reid to set up funding to study UFOs. Harry Reid sets up this $22 million program. My understanding, most of that money actually goes back to Bigelow. He actually ends up recouping a lot of that in terms of like contracts to like run it out of his ranch. And this is the advanced aerospace threat identification program that is funded thanks to Harry Reid and weirdo rich guy Robert Bigelow that employs Luis Elizondo to look at videos like the ones that you mentioned. Luis Elizondo does look at the videos, but he feels his work isn't being taken seriously, which is how, when he leaves his job, and I think it's early 2017, he ends up with Tom DeLonge, the Blink-182 guy, who is running this To the Stars think tank for identifying the little green men. Did I have all that right so far?
That is all right so far. And I think him joining To the Stars, the Tom DeLonge group, where he's working alongside Christopher Mellon, is I think a key pivotal point in sort of the cultural shift we've seen over the last 10 years, that they help make the New York Times story possible and publicize these videos that have now become so famous. There's sort of a funny story that Mellon tells about how they got the videos to the New York Times. So he claims that he met somebody in a parking lot who was a source of his from the Pentagon.
Whoa.
That they had like this real like all the president's men throat thing where they met in a parking lot, passed the videos off, and along with documentation showing it was approved for public release and unclassified. And Mellon has never told me, has to my knowledge, never told another journalist sort of who the source was. But that was the point at which he and To the Stars got the videos, and from him, the New York Times got the videos for their story.
So let's tell the story of how that. So they have the videos, and they have Luis Elizondo, who worked inside this like black budget program, out of the Bigelow Ranch, or connected somehow to the Bigelow Ranch. So they have this story. They want to get this out to the world, and they get Leslie Kean to help them do it. Because you've talked to her, can you tell us about who she is, what her beliefs are?
Sure. So Kane is like Mellon, she's kind of an East Coast Brahmin. She's the niece of Thomas Kane, who was governor of New Jersey and was the chair of the 9/11 Commission.
Wow.
Olds like us will remember him. His son, Thomas Kane Jr., Leslie Kane's cousin, is currently a congressman.
Really? Wow. So she's very connected.
Very, very connected. She's been interested in UFOs for years. So I would describe her as sort of a long form nonfiction, sort of book nonfiction writer.
Okay.
And she wrote a book in 2010 that was sort of a compilation of firsthand UFO experiences. And I think already there, she was showing off some political connections. One of her, the foreword for the book was written by John Podesta.
Wow.
Who was chief of staff at the White House.
Also kind of a UFO guy, right?
Very much a UFO guy. One thing I learned saying this is that people who you would think would have been informed about the UFOs.
Yeah, it's weird that he would have to be a conspiracy theorist. Can't he just walk down the hall and ask someone, are the UFOs real?
Told him. I mean, in the X-Files, they hide some things even from the president.
And this is kind of the wavelength that Leslie Kean is operating of. And Two of the Stars pulls her in to help publicize what they believe is evidence of UFOs, because she's a true believer herself. And she's been writing stuff a few months before that. She had a Huffington Post story about the Chilean Navy saw something that she thinks is a UFO, which is still not someone you would expect to get you on the front page of the New York Times. And that brings us to the last big personality who does land that for them and does get them on the front page of the Times. There's Ralph Blumenthal. Can you tell us about him?
So Ralph Blumenthal was a lifer at the New York Times. He worked there for 45 years, which you worked there for what, 6 or 7?
7, and that's plenty.
Yeah,
but God bless.
God bless. Ralph for making it longer. But he retired in 2009, and knew Leslie Kean, and I think most relevantly for these purposes, Blumenthal has also long been interested in extraworldly phenomena. So he wrote a biography of a guy named John Mack. He's a Pulitzer
UFO
Prize
abduction
winning
guy, right?
Yes, and
Okay.
So he was the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Med School for decades, and was sort of seen as a teen suicide and drug use expert. And so very, very respected guy who, toward the end of his career, started interviewing people who claimed that they had been abducted by aliens and became deeply convinced that they had been abducted by aliens.
And Blumenthal kind of believes this too, right? Or he believes that John Mack was onto something.
Exactly. There's sort of a Russian nesting doll of claims when it comes to UFOs and aliens.
Right.
And on the very outer layer, there's the universe is massive. Somewhere out there in the universe, there's another intelligent life form. That seems totally reasonable to believe. Maybe we haven't encountered it yet, but I don't think that's crazy at all. Somewhere in there, there's craft from another civilization has reached us and observed us. I haven't been convinced by the evidence, but that's one thing. We send craft out into the universe all the time. People might have encountered Voyager or Pioneer or whatever. Aliens have come close enough to Earth to get humans, take them into a craft, and then put them back again, is I think orders of magnitude more outlandish than they have just visited us.
Well, okay, so I think this is important because I'm not trying to drag Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal through the mud or anything. I think what's important to understand is these are the two people who pitch the New York Times, who write the story. But I think the thing that's important to understand here is they are recruited to do that, to package this story for the Times by Two of the Stars, not because they're writers and reporters, although they are, but also because they are themselves true believers. And they think that it's really important to get the word out as that, like, this paranormal X-Files stuff is true. And they see their role less as dispassionately reporting on, like, what does Luis Elizondo say happened at this program he worked on? What do these videos show? And maybe more bringing awareness to what they have always believed is the truth, which is that aliens are arriving at Earth. So I think that's important to, like, understand for how we now they get to the point of writing this big story in 2017 for the Times. Can you talk about how they landed that story?
Yeah, I mean, and Blumenthal said basically what you're saying. That I asked him sort of why didn't you include the stuff about alien abductions if you sort of were persuaded by this? And he said, it's much easier to interest people in the Times about something about UFOs than about alien encounters. Alien encounters seem too weird for them. So he was sort of making an Overton window argument. Yeah, you have to start with the thing that seems a little plausible, and then sort of once people are starting to accept the alien mindset, you can work them up to abductions. But the process was that Chris Mellon and To the Stars offered Leslie Kean the UFO videos on the condition that she was able to place the story in the New York Times. They didn't want her just going to Huffington Post or somewhere right on her personal blog or something. They wanted the imprimatur of like a serious news organization to sort of give this credibility as a real story. And so that's when Blumenthal got involved, and Blumenthal took the story directly to Dean Baquette, who at that point was the top editor at the Times. A co-author on many of their initial stories on this is Helene Cooper, who is a very well-respected sort of foreign correspondent. The sense I get is that that was mostly Blumenthal had already retired. Leslie Kean was not a New York Times reporter. Cooper was kind of like their chaperone, like putting someone who was a current staffer on with a byline as a way of sort of integrating these people who are outside of the normal apparatus.
We should say that's really unusual. It's unusual to have two outsiders who are not at the paper writing a front page investigative story. It's unusual that one of them is kind of a little bit of an activist. It's unusual that they pitched it directly to the executive editor of the paper. And it's unusual that they went from pitch to the front page in only 2 months. Like having run a lot of stories through that bureaucracy, that's very fast. And I think that's maybe context for how this all landed on the front page when in other circumstances, maybe it wouldn't have.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that staggered me, I've never worked at the Times, and so I anything I know about their internal processes is secondhand at best. But they do strike me as an organization that moves slow on some things, and that tries to wait until they have something dead to rights. That in 2020 there was the big story on Trump's taxes, for which they got sort of leaked tax returns and private financial information from Trump's niece. And
they spent years on it.
They took years and years to make sure that they had that dead to rights, as they should. And when it came to some of the claims in not just in 2017, but in some of the follow-up stories, the claim that off-world vehicles had reached Earth strikes me as much harder to believe than that Donald Trump cheated on his taxes. and
yet receives much less scrutiny. Yeah.
Right. Does not seem to have received the same level of fact-checking.
So the story comes out and it describes these 3 videos, which again are real. They're real videos that showed something happening. We're not sure what. They talk a lot to Luis Elizondo, who wrote at this advanced threat detection thing at the Pentagon and about his program. It also goes a little bit beyond that and talks a lot about like Robert Bigelow's the weird billionaire who was giving money to Harry Reid, stuff that's going on at his ranch. It talks about materials recovered from UFOs, but it's all secondhand. And my memory of the way that story was received, even though the story doesn't say this, but when people receive that story as UFOs are here, the Pentagon has known about it for years. It's now been leaked by people who left the Pentagon. And, you know, even if it's not aliens, it's definitely something that seems beyond what we think humans are capable of. And there's a lot of smoke here. Do you think that's right? That's like, is that how you remember it being received?
Yes, I think that is very much the impression. And I think like one of the more important claims that I saw in there was claims that one of Robert Bigelow's facilities was modified so it could house, and I'm quoting here, metal alloys and other materials that Mr. Elizondo and program contractors said had been recovered from unidentified aerial phenomena. And Blumenthal on MSNBC promoting the story said researchers couldn't tell you what these metal alloys were. It was not a metal alloy that humans on Earth were familiar with. And I think that was one of the first points where I was reading this, and I think where a lot of people read it, where our sort of eyebrows perked up, and a bunch of chemists started to chime in and say, you know, figuring out what alloy something is one of the things that chemists are really, really good at. Like, there's a lot of things that they still struggle with, but they have like defined techniques to sort through metal alloys. And the idea that like someone at the Pentagon would not be able to do this for something, that's a strong claim.
So Congress starts taking this pretty seriously. Can you talk about some of the things they do in response to these stories?
The investigations really pick up after 2017 and the New York Times stories. So there's something called the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, which released a sort of preliminary report on this in 2021, which was what sort of my piece back then was pegged to. And I think spurred a lot of coverage in a lot of quarters on this idea, because it was sort of a very public examination of this by a Pentagon that has been very
right.
But it didn't end there. There's also the Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group, the UAP Independent Study Team, and as you said, sort of a number of congressional hearings about this, where people like Elizondo and Mellon are called to Congress to testify and talk about what they know. I think part of what was interesting about that was there's a very different sort of tactical approach taken by the Pentagon, that it wasn't, we're going to just call these guys crazy. And I think some of that is explained by is a sort of a strategic decision of, people have questions about this, we shouldn't mock them for having questions about this. We should try to be open about it. But also sort of, this was a time when we were getting more hawkish towards both China and Russia. And I think many of the most plausible explanations I've seen for what these things are is that they might be things like the Chinese weather balloon we saw last year. Weather balloons obviously can't move super fast or do some of the things we saw in these videos. But there's just a long history of people getting recordings of aircraft that look super weird that later turns out to be sort of a secretive military project.
I see.
And that I think is something that Congress was more willing to hear in the context where they're really sort of eager to have or I wouldn't say eager, but except that we have an adversarial relationship with Russia and China.
Well, and there's kind of a great irony to all this, that as a result of that 2017 New York Times story playing up this now defunct and like kind of fake UFO tracking program that Harry Reid had funded and Luis Elizondo had worked for, that like as a result of that story, Congress then goes on to push through actually real Pentagon programs to examine the evidence around UFO videos. So it's this kind of like self-fulfilling, like it goes from fake to real as a result of reporting on the fake thing as if it was real.
It's such a great story about like the fractal complexity of essentially Pentagon bureaucracy.
Right. It is a bureaucracy story in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I had some conversation with Christopher Mellon where I asked sort of, couldn't this be even like a U.S. sort of secretive vehicle? His line was, I would have known if we had a craft like this. Like, I was high up enough that I would have known all of the different sort of experimental aircraft. And like maybe he has a much higher security clearance than I do. But I think one of my takeaways from this story is there's no one in the Pentagon who knows everything the Pentagon is doing.
That's true. Although we should say that a lot of these subsequent government-mandated investigations into the videos concluded that it was probably just, or that some of them were probably just like visual artifacts from things that were happening, or if it was like just a commercial plane taking off that produced something that just looked weird on an infrared camera. But I want to get back to the kind of narrative of how this is unfolding. So summer 2020, which is just when a lot of these big government investigations are happening and Congress is getting really involved, Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal do their second big story for the New York Times. And for me, this is when it felt like the wheels were kind of starting to come off on this campaign. Can you talk about what happened there and why that story started to create some weirdness around all this?
Yes. So the 2020 story is interesting in a lot of ways. One is that sort of the training wheels are off. It's Blumenthal and Kean. Helene Cooper is no longer involved. They're writing this on their own. And sort of the key focus of the story was that there was this investigation looking into these things, and that soon it was going to release a public report on UFO activity. And has a bunch of quotes from Marco Rubio, who was really urging sort of more disclosure about this. But the piece is also sort of talks to Harry Reid about his longstanding interest, talks to Luis Elizondo, and then buried in it are some pretty extreme claims that this is where sort of the wheels coming off come in. That I think went well beyond anything that the Times had reported before. So they quote a guy named Eric W. Davis, who we say a little more about in a minute, but who was a consultant on the UFO program that Elizondo worked on. And it quotes him as saying that the examination of the materials had not determined their source, and he concluded that we couldn't make the materials we got ourselves. And he further claimed that he had gotten a classified briefing as recently as March about retrievals from off-world vehicles not made on this Earth.
So the story is kind of suggesting that the Pentagon has alien UFOs that it's recovered, but it turns out the basis of this is a contractor who's kind of a weirdo who says he went to a meeting once where someone told him this. But this is again, a lot of people who are reading the newspaper and who believe what it says thinks, wow, the New York Times is telling me that the Pentagon has alien UFOs now.
If you read about like weird stuff the Pentagon has funded, Eric Davis will come up in stories you find about that. His sort of raison d'etre seems to be starting companies that get consulting jobs to look into sort of strange phenomena. He got a $7.5 million grant from the Air Force to study what he called psychic teleportation, or the ability to transport yourself across the earth with the power of your mind. And I definitely understand why that would be militarily relevant.
Doesn't mean it's real, or that we need to make this guy our source in the New York Times for saying the UFOs are here.
And when I talked to Blumenthal about this, he said, we didn't say that we verified it. We just said that he said it. And I don't know, like you know what you're doing when you include a line like that.
Sure.
And we have UFOs in a storage locker is like one of the greatest buried leads of all time.
So I think at this point, if you were just like a regular casual news consumer, your experience of this story is the New York Times has now confirmed multiple times in a row that the UFOs are here and that the Pentagon thinks they're probably little green men who are just like hanging out on the Southern California coast. But I think if you are like you or me and a like close follower of weird media stuff, or like know how to read between the lines of what happens in coverage, you start to see a lot of indications that the major media institutions have lost faith in this story. Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal only ever have one additional byline in the New York Times, and it's just like an update on a congressional hearing. All of the hearings and the like reports, the government reports that start coming out, all keep saying one after another. It's like, no, here's all the evidence. These are just weird visual artifacts in these videos, and it's probably not UFOs. But then I think the like big nail in this story comes like a year ago when Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal have their third big story on this, but it runs in this website called The Debrief. Had you ever heard of this website before?
It was new to me.
Yeah. So can you talk about like what the story says and what we should read, or what you, I should say, read into the fact that it appeared in the debrief and not, say, in the New York Times?
At this point, the Times pieces by Blumenthal and Kane have been getting progressively more extreme in what they're claiming. It's not just this unit at the Pentagon has seen some strange things. It's we have off-world vehicles. We have metal alloys that no one understands, and where it really takes off is this story for the debrief, and I think it's telling, as you say, that the Times didn't snap it up. So the heart of the piece is a guy named David Grush, who was a military veteran, fought in Afghanistan, worked for a couple of reconnaissance agencies, and was lead on sort of analysis of UAPs for something called the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which my understanding is that they do a lot of sort of satellite espionage stuff.
Yeah. Look at satellite photos, tell you what they say.
Right. And worked on the UAP task force, which wrote the sort of preliminary 2021 report that was fairly dismissive of the evidence here. And Grush in this piece tells Blumenthal and Kane that sort of the task force was basically doing a cover up. That they didn't include everything that they knew, including he said there were fragments of exotic origin, reflecting a non-human intelligence. That he had learned about as part of his service on the task force, and that this was not mentioned at all in the UAP task force report. And so he this fits very well in sort of the narrative that they want to tell of sort of brave truth tellers in the military being silenced by the powers that be. That the UAP task force was not the government opening up. It was them sort of silencing people who wanted to vouch for the real evidence of aliens, and sort of making a hero of this guy Grush. And I think there were a lot of things about Grush's testimony that raised red flags. Sort of specifically the idea that there were these specific materials recovered from other civilizations that were being stored somewhere. Like that's a big claim, and also like seems like it should be provable. Like you should be able to produce those materials. And I think it got even more dramatic when he testified before Congress, and he claimed that not only has material from these UFOs been recovered, but life forms, biological life forms, have been recovered. And people can watch this hearing online. Maybe you buy them, maybe you don't. I think what's striking about the hearing is that every time a member of Congress asked him to elaborate on this, he kind of deflected. He admitted he had never seen these vehicles or bodies. He said it was just based on witnesses that he had interviewed, and would his go-to response when people asked sort of follow-up questions was, "I can only tell you this in a skiff." So a skiff is a sensitive, compartmented information facility, which are where some sort of super high security debriefings and things happen in the intelligence community. And so I think I got the impression from that hearing that this is a guy who's making some really wild claims, but when pressed on them, hides behind confidentiality. So I did not personally move my views on this very much in response to him. But I think you're right that as a media story, the fact that he could only get this sort of obscure website to care about it, and that Kane and Blumenthal weren't able to place anything in the New York Times where they had been writing, was maybe reflective that some higher ups and sort of the media industry generally is starting to look at this more skeptically.
Well, and Vanity Fair reported too that Leslie Cade, Ralph Blumenthal had tried to get this in the New York Times. The New York Times said no. They took it to the Washington Post. The Washington Post spent weeks on it trying to confirm any of the information on it. They passed. They took it to Politico, and Politico passed. And I think what is really striking to me, kind of looking back over the whole arc of the story and how it rose and fell, is that everything that was weird about that story last year that nobody wanted to run and ended up having to run on this obscure kind of fringy website, The Debrief, was also true to some extent of their first stories. Like all the stories in the New York Times, a lot of it rested on one weird guy who was in the government. A lot of it rested on second or third hand claims. And I think something that I'm really left with, and I'm really curious for your thoughts on, is why did it take us 6 years to kind of come around to finally being skeptical about something that we should have been skeptical about from the beginning? Was it that we wanted to believe it? Were we just eager to buy into this despite the evidence? What do you think happened there?
So I think one piece of context for 2017 is so much of the news was so bleak that it wasn't just that Trump was president, but that was the fall of Weinstein, that Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohy did their big report that fall. The first initial wave of Me Too, Charlie Rose, Kevin Spacey, Louis C.K., on and on. And so sort of the news cycle was being dominated by a president who was completely out of control and seemed eager to start a nuclear war, and sort of collapse of I don't know if collapse is strong, but sort of a key sort of misogynistic assumptions in our society being very weakened, and a real cultural rupture happening on that. And I think a lot of the reaction I saw to it then was just fun, aliens. And that's a very human thing to want to find something sort of lighter and kind of goofy when the news is like that. And I think it also helped that it wasn't very polarized.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Marco Rubio and Harry Reid both are really into aliens. There isn't an obvious if we knew what the aliens wanted to do on capital gains taxes, maybe there would be a real divide there. But are there aliens seems fairly neutral.
Right. It's not a culture war divide.
Yeah, it I think was a story that sort of filled a need that people had at that particular moment. And it's not just the New York Times that I think 60 Minutes did a lot with these fighter pilots.
Yeah.
A lot of people, I mean, hell, even me writing sort of a skeptical piece on it was participating in this to some degree.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real thing in journalism that isn't always a bad impulse. It's fine to entertain people.
Right.
But you can't let your factual standards lapse as part of that.
I think it's a really important point about these stories came out in two moments, 2017 and summer 2020, when the news was really scary. And I was scared. Everybody felt really upset. And it's a fun diversion. I think there is also, I think it speaks to something deeper too. I think when the world feels out of control, as it did in those times because of Trump, because of COVID, we are just much more prone to believe conspiracies in those moments. When things feel out of control, we kind of want to reach for these larger explanations, for these hidden forces controlling things. And that's why things feel this way. It's not just that the world is chaos. And there's also a social media participatory element to this, where when we all feel scared and out of control, this is something that we can all come together and talk about aha, now we all see that the aliens are real. And now we see that Kate Middleton is the Mahdi, and she's come back, and that's why we're not seeing photos of her anymore. And I think this sense of I
hadn't heard that one. That's good.
Well, you're hearing it here first. We're breaking this news. I found this Brendan Nyhan thing. It's our friend, Brendan Nyhan is a Dartmouth University political scientist who wrote in 2017, right around the time this story came out, about how conspiracy belief among Democrats were suddenly way, way up because conspiracies, even if they're unrelated to politics, fill this psychological need that gets created when the world seems, very scary or menacing or out of control. And I think it's also important to talk about this as a form of conspiracy belief among people like us, basically, who do not typically think of ourselves as prone to conspiracy belief because, it's not a conspiracy, it appeared in the New York Times.
Yeah, it's nice to have your one sort of pet theory. We had a running gag when we were coworkers at Vox about my deep belief that UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was assassinated.
Yeah,
and that felt like and like I kind of do believe that, but like, but beyond sort of the factual sort of stuff there, like it's super safe. It's 60 years ago and no one cares.
Yeah,
and I think like aliens filled a kind of similar hole for people. I think the other thing is that it's at the one hand kind of silly and off the beaten track. On the other hand, it's so big,
right,
that it's in some ways like would be the biggest news story ever if aliens really were here and were interacting with us, because the world would turn out to not just be humans,
right.
And I think there's ways in which that's comforting too, the way that kind of nihilistic, like who even cares about Trump? Like we're all going to be dead from global warming in 20 years stuff can be kind of oddly comforting for some kinds of people.
Right. Here's a conspiracy theory that's fun to believe in, that I have permission to believe in because it's in these big media outlets, and that makes all the things that are scary in the news like Donald Trump or COVID feel so much more manageable because they're so much smaller in response. I think it's really smart. And I guess it's a case for, while I have some complaints for the people who put this story on the front page of major news outlets, I guess it's a case for giving grace to people who let themselves maybe get a little carried away with believing in UFOs, even if there was evidence at the time that we probably should have been more skeptical. Well, Dylan, where can we hear or read you these days?
I'm a senior correspondent at Vox, so you can read my stories over there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about this. I found it really helpful to kind of disentangle this story. When you see the whole timeline, it all makes a lot more sense. And even if there are not little green men out there yet, if there are, we would love to have you on offline. So please get in touch with us and we'll invite you on for it.
I can't wait.